If God is the source of everything that exists, how could you ever fail to see him? This question highlights a tension between religious language and ordinary experience. Traditions speak of divine omnipresence, yet daily life feels marked by absence. We navigate schedules, screens, and social exchanges without any obvious perception of the sacred. From a neuroscientific perspective, that gap is unsurprising. Perception is contingent on attention. The classic demonstrations of inattentional blindness, popularized by Daniel, Simons and colleagues, show that when attention is narrowly focused, salient events can occur in front of us and still go unseen. Ibn Arabi proposes a radical explanation. The real is not missed because it hides. It is missed because it is too present, so pervasive that cognitive systems treat it as background and filter it out. This lecture integrates Ibn Arabi's metaphysics with findings from psychology and neuroscience to clarify why the sacred can be in plain sight and yet overlooked, and how perception can be retrained to recognize it. Modern life trains perception toward surfaces. Productivity dashboards, digital feeds, and social metrics capture attention and fragment it across competing stimuli. The result is attentional fragmentation, a constant shifting of focus that impairs depth of perception. In psychological terms, we increasingly live through representation rather than direct experience. We manage symbols, messages, posts, scores more than we inhabit phenomena. From a neuroscientific perspective, the default mode network, identified by Marcus, Rachel, and others, is persistently active in self-referential narrative, ruminative future-past simulations, and evaluations of status or threat. When the DMN dominates, awareness roots through the story of me rather than the immediacy of perception. This narrows the bandwidth for presence. Sociologically, secular assumptions reframe reality as exclusively material and publicly measurable. Transcendence is relegated to belief or private feeling and thus becomes psychologically invisible within shared discourse. Ibn Arabi diagnosed an analogous problem in the 13th century Hijbail Today, the veil of habit. What is always present becomes cognitively discounted. The ordinary is no longer transparent to its source. It becomes opaque through familiarity. To understand how to reverse this opacity, we need Ibn Arabi's analysis of perception as both a revelation and a concealment of the real. Ibn Arabi, known as Al-Shaykh, Al-Akbar, constructed an exacting ontology of consciousness. In works such as Al-Fatah, Omakiyah, and Fu al-Ikm, he argues that perception is not merely a human operation upon the world. It is itself a mode of divine self-disclosure. Reality is a continuum of appearance. The real becomes knowable by manifesting in forms. Within this framework, the human does not manufacture perception so much as host it. The eye sees, but sight as such is a gift of being. When perception misreads what it reflects streeting form as self-sufficient, rather than as disclosure, the sacred appears absent. Modern cognitive science, with its model-based view of perception, echoes this. The brain infers the world through predictions constrained by prior learning. Those priors can either occlude or attune. Ibn Arabi's question becomes practical: which cognitive habits veil and which reveal? Ibn Arabi holds that habit is the thickest veil. What is constant disappears from notice. Consider breathing. It is omnipresent, yet rarely perceived until disrupted. In laboratory terms, this is habituation. Repeated exposure reduces neural response, as shown in classic learning research. Sensory systems adapt to persistent inputs to conserve resources, elevating change and suppressing constancy. From a neuroscientific perspective, sensory adaptation and predictive coding work together. When input matches expectation, neural error signals diminish and attention disengages. If the divine is the invariant ground of all experience, then the perceptual economy treats it like the omnipresent and therefore ignored to reperceive the constant. One must defamiliarize the ordinary. Techniques that introduce novelty or slow observation, such as mindful attention to everyday actions, temporarily reset priors and restore salience to what always is. Ibn Arabi insists that creation is not other than God. It is God's self-disclosure in multiplicity. However, cognition divides experience into subject versus object of function. Localization, prediction, and control require boundaries. This partition is neurally supported by parietal networks that maintain body-world separation. Studies of contemplative and mystical states report decreased activity in regions tracking correlating with experiences of unity. In psychological terms, duality is an adaptive heuristic that becomes ontological prejudice. The mind treats perceived separations as ultimate. For Ibn Arabi, this is a category error. The forms are not independent substances. They are mirrors in which the one, reality, appears. The aim is to cultivate vestibular perception, the capacity to function with distinctions while recognizing their dependence on a more fundamental unity. This is not a collapse of difference, but a reframing of difference as relational appearance. Conceptual knowledge is a veil over direct witnessing, Ibn Arabi warns. Concepts compress experience into symbols. This is efficient but lossy. Reading about a forest is not walking through one. Knowing a definition of compassion is not perceiving a compassionate act. Cognitively, we are vulnerable to semantic saturation and labeling bias. Repeated terms lose qualitative depth, and labels preempt observation. The map replaces the territory. Religious discourse is not immune. Doctrines can become substitutes for encounter. The remedy is preconceptual observation, briefly suspending labels to contact phenomena as phenomena. In phenomenology, Husserl less Epish performs this bracketing. In Sufi terms, it approaches mashahada, or witnessing. The goal is to let form present its meaning before concepts pre-shape it. For Ibn Arabi, the self is the most intimate veil, the presumption that I see as an autonomous observer. He argues that only the real truly perceives. The self is the lens through which this perception occurs. Neuroscience complicates the intuition of authorship. Libet's work and subsequent studies show preparatory brain activity preceding conscious awareness of intention, suggesting that the sense of willing can be post-constructed. Psychology further documents self-relevance biases. Attention disproportionately locks onto stimuli tied to the self, narrowing the field and reinforcing egoic centrality to loosen this veil. Cultivate metacognitive awareness, observing thoughts, emotions, and intentions as events rather than as essence. As the observer softens, perception becomes less about a private subject looking at objects and more about seeing as such. What Ibn Arabi names Theopany, Theophany. Ibn Arabi articulates a paradox. God is al here, the most manifest, and al, by, in the most hidden. How can both be true? The answer is structural. The real is hidden as the act of seeing, like air, indispensable yet unnoticed. The divine grounds perception so completely that it disappears into its own function. Philosophically, this resembles Heidegger's claim that being is concealed in making beings available. What enables showing does not itself stand as an object among objects. Cognitively, perception can analyze objects, but cannot directly objectify the process of perceiving while it is occurring. You can become reflective about sight, but in the moment of seeing, sight recedes. Ibn Arabi's formulation is that God veils himself by himself. The same light that reveals forms is the light we forget to notice. Recognition, therefore, involves a shift of stance from seeking an object called God to realizing the ground of appearing in every perception, translating metaphysics into training. We can articulate for disciplines that recalibrate perception. Practice 1. Attention training. The goal is to increase perceptual stability and depth. Daily sessions of focused attentions, such as on breath or ambient sound, gradually lengthened, strengthen salience and frontoparietal networks, improving signal to noise and reducing distractibility. In Sufi practice, muraqabah, or steady watchfulness, cultivates familiarity with presence without forcing interpretation. Practice 2. Cognitive defamiliarization. The goal is to counteract habituation to the constant. Deliberately engage routine activities as first-time events, slow eating, silent walks, micro-observation of common objects. Novelty stimulates dopaminergic pathways and reweights predictive priors, increasing sensitivity to baseline context. The ordinary regains dimensionality. Constancy becomes perceptually available rather than filtered out. Practice 3. Observation without conceptualization. The goal is to reduce interference from premature labeling. Brief intervals of label-free view tending to phenomena before naming decrees, top-down semantic priming, allowing bottom-up features to update the model. Concepts then resume their proper role as maps after contact with the terrain of experience. Practice 4. Relational awareness. The goal is to dissolve the rigid subject-object stance. During interactions, notice shifts in identification. See emotions and intentions as co-arising in a relational field. Compassion and perspective-taking practices modulate DMN activity and enhance empathy and regulation. The Sufi analog is seeing each encounter as a mirror of the real distinct faces, one appearing. These practices enact a perceptual re-education consistent with cognitive science and consonant with Ibn Arabi's claim that theophany is continuous and that the obstacle is style of attention, not scarcity of presence. Ibn Arabi's central lesson is precise. The sacred never hides. Our habits of perception do the hiding. When attention is captured by surfaces, when duality is mistaken for separation, when concepts replace contact, and when the eye claims ownership of seeing, the obvious becomes invisible. Neuroscience affirms the mechanism. Perception tracks attention, and attention follows priors. Change the priors. Train attention. Reality discloses features that were always there. The transformation is not from absence to presence, but from opacity to transparency. You miss God not because He is beyond the world, but because you stop at the world. Look through rather than let the ordinary become a medium rather than a wall. When perception becomes transparent, every face, sound, and moment functions as a mirror of the real. The task is not to summon the sacred, but to notice that you are seeing by its light already.